What's up, everyone? I'm Joe Pompliano, and this is the Joe Pomp Show. I'm joined today for a special episode with Val Ackerman. Val has done it all in sports, it seems. She is the current commissioner of the Big East Conference, but she has also worked for the NBA. She worked in the WNBA, was a board of directors for USA Basketball, is in the Basketball Hall of Fame. Val, we have a lot to talk about, but thank you so much for joining me. How are you?
Great, Joe. Great. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Good to be here.
Of course. So let's start with the Big East. The Big East is in a unique spot in college sports, I would say, given that the Big East focus is almost exclusively really on basketball, where most of the value with media rights and everything else is derived. If you look at college sports today, you guys went and signed a new media rights deal over the last year. It's a very lucrative deal for the conference, but it doesn't necessarily stack up with some of the other deals when it comes to the big college football programs. I think most people understand that, but where did the advantages and the disadvantages come with that when you go to negotiate these deals?
Well, let me just start by saying the Big East is now in its 45th year and has been through a lot of change over that 4-decade-plus span, including some change that hasn't been all that positive. It was really the Big East a decade plus ago that was in the midst of the kind of upheaval we're seeing now with some other conferences. And so the Big East today is a byproduct of those changes, the decision of the presidents at that time to reconfigure and to go back to the basketball focus that got the league going in 1979. So we are in a unique spot. I'm with you 100% because we don't sponsor football. We do sponsor 22 sports here, led by men's and women's basketball, but football is not one of them. And so to your question, that really does put us in a different box in the NCAA org chart. We don't play football. Some of our schools do. We don't sponsor it, but we have been able, through the leadership on our campuses and some good decisions that have been made at the conference level, we do compete with all of the big football schools in basketball. And evidence of that is our performance in the NCAA tournament, which is the opportunity every year that all of the schools and conferences come together. We've won 4 of the last 8 men's basketball tournaments played, more than any other league. So we have figured out a way to keep it going at our level, particularly in basketball. TV is a big part of that, to get to your question. When the new Big East was reconfigured in 2013, that came on the backs of a national television agreement, 12-year deal with Fox Sports, which at that time was launching FS1 and needed the wintertime programming. So there the Big East was, very fortuitous circumstances. We're in the last year of that. Back in June, we entered into a renewal of that agreement with Fox. That will take us out another 6 years after this one. We're adding 2 other broadcast partners in NBC Peacock and Warner Brothers Discovery. So we're going to have a split package starting next year. So the exposure is fabulous, particularly for men's basketball. Are the revenues the same as they are for the major football conferences? They're not. And that's because we don't have football. And most people in the business will tell you it really is football that's driving the value of media contracts in the college space. So we don't have those revenues. I would sort of add, though, that we don't have their distractions or their expenses either. And some of those attributes are, I think, contributing to some of the changes you're seeing elsewhere that we've been largely immune from. Conference realignment, some of the more difficult decisions that have to be made by football-driven schools, we're out of that fray. Where that'll get us in a few years' time, I think, is anybody's guess. But back to my earlier comments, I think the combination of our history, the basketball focus, the rivalries that we have, our television going forward, the ability to play at Madison Square Garden, which has been the home of the Big East tournament for more than 40 years. We've got that deal sealed for the next 8. Passionate fan bases. I mean, all the things that make college conferences and schools strong, we've got that in the Big East. So I'm optimistic about the future.
Well, it's made travel a little bit easier, too, now that we have West Coast schools going to the East Coast.
And geography.
Exactly. I want to double click on the TV deal that you mentioned there for a second, because you mentioned how you guys are going to still have the deal with Fox, but you've added a couple other partners too. And this seems to be a trend that we've seen throughout sports. I think the NFL has done it for a very long time here, where they've worked with a handful of broadcasters. And even so, we're still seeing them add in new people like Netflix. But why was it so important for the Big East to add more partners and distribute those games through multiple channels?
Well, it's really pretty simple. I mean, Fox, when they had entered into the agreement, Fox Sports in 2013, the original deal that brought all of our schools together in the current configuration, they were starting a new network, FS1. They frankly needed the tonnage of wintertime programming that our basketball games allowed for. So they bought really everything and were able to put it on their various platforms, mostly FS1, but also Fox Broadcast Network and some FS2. Since 2013, Fox Sports has been acquiring other properties, not surprisingly. So including, in college basketball, they don't have the NBA, but they do have Big Ten in basketball. They've got the Big 12 in basketball. They've got some other conferences. I believe they have the Mountain West. So they didn't need as much programming as they needed 11 years ago. So they were able to, basically decide that they wanted to have more of a split package, and they were the primary network in this negotiation. The good news for us was, even though Fox wasn't prepared to take everything like they did last time, as it related to basketball, other networks were interested in getting a piece of the Big East. So that opened the door for discussions with NBC and Peacock in particular, which is a growing platform. And we expect more growth there because of the Olympics this past summer, where Peacock loomed large. And also the new NBA deal was likely to drive additional subscribers to that platform. They had the Big Ten last year, so they were able to kind of cut their teeth on college basketball through the Big Ten. So we feel like we're in good company with that partner. And then last but not least, Warner Brothers Discovery, which is one of the two principal carriers of the NCAA men's basketball tournament, national tournament, has taken a piece of the Big East package as well. So we're going to have games starting next year on some combination of TBS, True, TNT, and probably some Max as sort of simulcasting. So it doesn't bother us to have the split package. It just means we're going to be in more places. I do think it puts a premium on cross-promotion, Joe, because, it was easy to tell our fans we're basically on FS1. But now that we're in different places, I think the burden will be on us and our networks to do an effective job of cross-promoting so that our fans know where to find us across all of these platforms.
Absolutely.
It's a plus. We see it as a plus.
Yeah, I think so too, especially because you might be able to draw in some new fans from those platforms that weren't watching Big East basketball beforehand. But you've seen a lot of stuff across television and sports. I mean, with the NBA, the WNBA, now college sports, you've seen the landscape change over 30 plus years now. When you think about where we are today, a lot of people have been saying for a long period of time that, cable's going down, these deals are eventually going to implode, they're going to get smaller. But we've really seen the opposite over the last decade as new streaming platforms have come in. Where do you think about where we are today and what that might look when this deal's up?
Well, I think, we're just seeing the beginnings of the scale of streaming distribution of sports contests. I mean, it wasn't a thing when we entered into our deal with Fox Sports 11 years ago. And now it's a bigger thing, to put it mildly. We sense that it's tied to sort of generational differences in the way that fans consume sports. So in our case, our fan base includes alums of our schools who may be in their 50s or 60s and maybe more accustomed to watching a game on a television network, on a traditional linear outlet, whereas a young alum of one of our schools or a current student who's not able to go to the game in person but wants to watch it may be more inclined to watch it on a so-called second or third screen. So, and they're obviously getting more and more facile with the world of apps and that sort of mechanism of tying into a sports event. So I think we're convinced it's the future. I think for us, we still have significant linear distribution of our games through those networks this year and then in our new deal. And so our Peacock package is really kind of the minority position, if you will. But our expectation is that when this deal expires in 2031, we expect that streaming may be an even bigger, component on the menu of options for how our fans have the opportunity to consume our games. It sounds like they're dabbling as well. They're testing the waters. They're trying to get a better sense of what this means for their businesses. And so I would describe it, Joe, as a bit of a learning curve for everybody at this point. And it may well be that in 6 years' time, 7 years' time for us, there may be players that aren't even on the radar screen right now that are jumping into this in a big way. So that was one reason why our deal is only 6 years and not something longer, not like our current deal, which is 12 years. We did want to leave open the possibility that there could be additional changes in the space that might work to our advantage. And we wanted to hold our options open to be in business with them if that was called for.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about what you just said, right, which is the idea that new players might come in when this deal is up, streaming literally didn't exist when you did the previous deal. So the market has obviously changed and it may change again. But this is TV rights. This is obviously the biggest bucket. I think a sneaky bucket that people often forget about, especially with a basketball conference, is NCAA performance. You alluded to a little bit before of how many tournaments you guys have won. UConn is obviously kind of the preeminent basketball program now in the country. Maybe talk a little bit, one, about how the NCAA revenue sharing works in the tournament and how the schools are rewarded in the conference. But also I'm curious, like, based on performance now, is this something you guys are budgeting in at the beginning of the year? Like, we expect to have X number of teams in. We expect to win as many games as you guys have won over the past few years?
Yes, we do. Really, as we build our budget, that is a revenue line item that we try to project out. And we have what we think is a conservative, I won't give it to you, but we do try to project out based on past performance, our optimism about the strength of our programs, how many bids we would get into the NCAA tournament, and then how many wins. And those are the two things that are rewarded in the NCAA's revenue distribution model. Every school that gets a bid gets a unit, so-called unit. And then if you win, you get an additional unit for the number of wins up until the Final Four. That's a sort of a question I can't answer, is why the unit flow ends after the Elite Eight round. But we do budget for that. It's an important component of our revenue stream because we get a fair number of units every year. The way the units are paid out over a rolling 6-year period. So there's a value to the unit, but you don't get it all up front the very next season. It's paid out over the succeeding 6 years following the tournament in which the units are earned. So again, we've had success on the court that's translated into financial rewards. It may be of interest to your listeners to know that the NCAA, which historically has only awarded performance units for men's basketball, is about to award units for women's basketball. And that was an outgrowth of some equity concerns that were surfaced over the last several years, and some questions raised about the fact that there was a men's unit and not a women's. That is about to be approved by the relevant committees within the NCAA. It'll be based on performance starting this year, with the units starting to be paid next year, as has been the practice. So again, that's, we've been very successful there, as you've noted. Again, our success has held up over the last several years. And so, we're hopeful. Now, where the future of that model goes, I can't tell you. I hope it remains intact. There could be adjustments, for example, when the NCAA's TV agreement expires in, I believe, 2032. But for now, it's basically a fixture on the budget projections for every conference.
Yeah, and for those who are listening and trying to do a little math in their head, a unit at last year's tournament, I think, was worth $2 million. So you make the tournament, you get a unit, you get a win, you get another unit. You guys had several teams. You can do the math. It's a lot of money that adds up over a 6-year period, right? It's not all up front, but it comes in. But that's an interesting point. And you mentioned a little bit about women's basketball there and the potential of them receiving units coming up here. They had more viewers in the men's tournament. I think that's well documented at this point. People have been very excited about it. That was sort of unique, in my opinion, right? You had one on broadcast, one on cable. You had the stars that we had in the game. There were some unique instances of where maybe that wouldn't be able to be replicated. But it also feels like, on the other hand, that we're seeing a little bit of a shift. Not necessarily that men's basketball is declining, but that women's basketball is catching up when it comes to the collegiate game. Do you think that was an outlier that we won't see again for a while? Or do you think that we're getting to a point now where women's basketball is going to see steady growth at the collegiate level every year and going to be able to match men's basketball to some degree in the years to come?
Maybe a little of both. I mean, I think Caitlin Clark in particular was just a generational star. Combination of the great play, the chasing of the record. Let's not forget that was a big storyline during the back half of the season, where she was actually in line to set the NCAA all-time leading scoring record that had been set by Pete Maravich decades ago. I mean, that was captivating to any basketball fan. And then she has proven that interest, that appeal wasn't just a college sports thing. It's obviously carried over to the WNBA in ways that really had never been seen before. So I do think there was something exceptional about the fact that she was involved. But I do think women's basketball has turned a corner. She's not the only star in the women's game. One thing I would note, Joe, which I think bears noting, is there is no early entry in the WNBA. There's no one and dones. This has been the rule since the onset of the launch of the league in 1997, is essentially a minimum age requirement. And that minimum age is 22. So it basically lines up with the amount of years that a player would be in college. So what that means for women's basketball is, assuming they're not transferring, that means that a star player like a Paige Beckers, in our case in UConn this year, Caitlin last year, they're with their schools over a period of years. They're identified to those programs. If they have success at the national level, people pay attention to that and then can look forward to following them the next year and the year after that. So there really is a way to develop stars in women's college basketball because of longevity and because of their ties to their programs that have frankly become lost in men's basketball. One, because of one and done or two and done. And number two, because of transfers. The transfer rates in college basketball have really escalated because of the onset of the transfer portal and the permissiveness around that ability to change schools. So I do think that's a factor as well, which works to the benefit of women's college basketball and also the WNBA, because when these young women now come to the WNBA, they're known commodities. People know who they are. There are fans who are now eager and interested to see how they do at the next level. And I think you saw that in full force at the WNBA draft this past year.
Yeah, it feels like the transfer portal on its own is a great thing, right? Like the ability to let people go transfer, leave, say their head coach leaves or whatever it is, they should be allowed to do that. NIL on its own is a great thing, allowing players to monetize their name, image, and likeness. But it feels like when you put those two things together at the same time with maybe a little bit less oversight than I think some people might have expected, there's some problems, specifically more probably in college football, but certainly some in college basketball as well, with people leaving different schools and kind of rotating. Where, as a commissioner, do you sit on that, right? Like, part of it is the NCAA, part of it is the schools, and the league is almost like, the conference is almost in this weird like middle spot where you don't really want to make guidelines that apply to everyone across the board, but you can't really control the specific players or the schools either.
It's a little bit powerless, to be honest. Once the decision was made to allow basically unrestricted transfers, that's a big change. It used to be in a sport like basketball, if you transferred, you could go to class, you could practice, but you couldn't play in games. That was the so-called year in residence. That went away a few years ago, in part because of legal concerns about the restrictiveness there. To your point, in part because coaches were coming and going. Why would the kid have to stay? So once that happened, it really became very hard to sort of, prevent what we're seeing now. I can tell you there was a time, for a long time, the Big East had a rule that prohibited transfers of basketball players among our schools. So if you were playing basketball at Providence, we had a rule that said you couldn't transfer to St. John's. It was basically a keep the peace rule that was in the books for many years at the request of the coaches. And once the legal environment started to change around transfers, once the NCAA changed their rule, we felt that we would be disadvantaged if we didn't allow student athletes in our league to transfer to another school in our conference. In fact, part of the reasoning was, well, if they're going to leave, maybe it's better to keep them in the Big East than having them go to the ACC or the Big Ten or the SEC. So we actually adjusted. And that was a conference decision, to your question. That's where we did step in and make a change. But right now, I mean, we try to track on it. I will tell you that NIL and transfers are very much intersecting here. So you are seeing transfers, not just because they don't want to play for that coach anymore or be closer to home or didn't get enough minutes. It really does in some cases come down to the money. And is that good for the athletes? Probably. It's never a bad thing not to get money. But I can tell you it's been very disruptive in college basketball. And I think it has affected the job description for coaches because they're dealing with high turnover on their rosters. They're going to have to work hard to get teams to be gelling quickly. And that's a particular skill set. We wonder about the educational impact. This is supposed to be about going to class after all and getting your degree. It is. It's not. That's why it's different from the NBA. But if a student athlete is jumping around from school to school, it's hard to imagine that they're keeping up with their classwork and making progress to getting a degree. And the fact is, most of these basketball players are not going to make it in the NBA. The ones that are, okay, they can get their degree later or whatever, or cash out later. But I do worry about the impact from an education standpoint on some of these changes. And I think our schools like ours care about that and are doing their best to try to keep that, priority in mind. But the upheaval in college basketball around this, I would say, has been real. And it's really hard for anybody to crystal ball what this is going to look like in the next year or 2 or 5. No one's really sure.
Speaking of coaches and increased responsibilities or changing job description, how much did you smile when you heard Dan Hurley was staying at UConn?
Oh, I'm smiling now. I'm very happy. I mean, obviously that he, elected to stay in the conference. It's not a surprise that he would get propositioned, and I'm sure it won't be the last time, especially if his success continues, that he'll be approached. I would like to think I can't speak for him. I would like to think, this is me, Val, that he's got a great home in the Big East, and that if he remains in college basketball, that he'll be where he is. I can't predict what he might do if he gets another offer to go to an NBA team, if that's an itch he feels like he needs to scratch. I do know that his family's very important to him, and their perspectives probably weighed in heavily on this. He's a Jersey guy. I like to remind him. His wife Andrea is from Jersey. His parents live in Jersey City, right across from where I'm sitting. So I think it's nice to know those kinds of things matter when people make these kinds of decisions. So, but I have great respect for the Lakers. I know Jeannie Buss. I knew her dad and worked with her and him. And so it was a very credible offer in my judgment. And, it's the Lakers after all. So very glad that he stayed. And I know he's now very much focused on what he can get done this year. I know he keeps talking about a three-peat, which would be a massive accomplishment. And I can't speculate on whether that's realistic or not, given how good the other teams he'll be competing against are. But the fact that he's focused on basketball now and just getting his work done at UConn, I think just speaks about where his priorities are.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that's going to be his last call. But if I was you, I'd feel happy or confident in the fact that it's the Lakers. And if you're not going to go to the Lakers, where else are you going to go? But speaking of the NBA, you used to work at the NBA for David Stern. What was it like working for David Stern?
It was really it was a career-making experience. I mean, I started out there as a staff lawyer. I was hired by Gary Bettman, now the commissioner of the NHL. Gary at that time was the general counsel of the NBA.
Does every commissioner of every sports league or organization have their law degree?
A lot of us do. Handy, especially in college sports right now.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to be totally funny there. It's actually an advantage. But I worked for Gary, have great respect for him, stayed in touch. I also worked for Russ Granick, another lawyer who was the longtime deputy commissioner at the NBA and a mentor and friend. And then I started working for David about 18 months in as his first chief of staff. And that was, it was a learning experience. I mean, I was in his office. I was on calls with him. I got to see what crossed his desk. I got a little bit into the mind of somebody who I know will go down as one of the greatest executives ever in the history of sports. He made the NBA into what it is today. Adam Silver has obviously taken the ball and run with it in terms of keeping the NBA going and growing. But David was, a combination of, charming, caring, but also could be really hard on us. And so, I have moments of like walking out of his office in tears because he thought of something I hadn't thought of. And I learned my lesson because I hadn't thought about it. So he was very demanding, brilliant guy, had the ability to look around corners and look into the future in ways that seemed like, we mortals weren't always able to do. But I learned a lot from him. And frankly, when I go through, my paces every day on the job now at the Big East, I do think from time to time, okay, I'm in a different world than David. He didn't work in college sports, so he doesn't know what I'm going through right here with this. But I do think often, like, how would David attack this problem? How would his legal mind have thought through this? What would have been his reaction to this? So he, my friendship, my relationship with him has truly been the gift that keeps on giving.
Amazing. And I think I've heard you say in the past that you were, when you got to the NBA, I think you were employee number 98 or something like that, but it was less than 100 at the time.
Exactly.
And the NBA, yeah, people often think of the NBA today and there's thousands of employees, offices all over the world. It's a massive, massive business, but it was much different back then. When you look back, is there any like inflection point or anything that you look at and say like that led to the growth that we saw or over the early 2000s or 2010s?
I would say a couple things. One is I joined in 1988. As you said, when the office was quite small, it was less than 100 people. It was a floor and a half at Olympic Tower. David doubled the size of the office in the next few years. So we pretty quickly got up to hundreds. When I joined, Magic and Larry were cresting. Their rivalry in the pros was cresting. And that was attracting a lot of attention. Michael Jordan was coming up with the Bulls. And so those three in particular were really captivating the interest of fans. Attendance numbers were growing, et cetera. Television ratings were climbing. So I would say them, number one. Number two, the Dream Team, which I had a chance to work on as a young executive at the league. Having that team at that time playing for their country really formed a foundation for not only domestic interest, but interest in the league globally. And it was really, for me, just personally, a career highlight to be able to travel with the first Dream Team. First domestically when they had to play in their qualifying tournament in Portland, and then when they were in Monaco. I was at the infamous practice in Monte Carlo that people talk about where Magic and Michael were going after each other in the practice. I was there. It was true. Everything you read about it is true. And then, of course, when they went on to Barcelona to win the gold medal. So that was the beginning of it's been a very fruitful relationship with USA Basketball over the last 6 years. I was part of the early years of that, which was critically important, I think, to the growth of the NBA, again, particularly internationally. And then last but not least, I do, credit David with the vision and the ability to recognize the importance of women to the game of basketball. And that led to the support that of the USA Basketball women's team beginning in 1996 that led to the gold medal for them that the NBA was supporting, and then ultimately the launch of the WNBA in 1997. The WNBA has been a tremendous investment for the league, I know. It was sort of on a plateau stage for a while after an incredible start that we had. And now it's been just amazing to see how those investments are paying off now with the surge of interest in women's basketball over the last couple of years in particular. And then David was, behind all of that. And on top of it all, just his vision around technology, community service, the importance of diversity and equity and inclusion at a time when nobody else was talking about it. He really did lay the groundwork for all of that. And to your point, Joe, all of that was really coming together, I would say, in the late 80s, the 90s, and into the 2000s, up until the time he stepped down.
Yeah, so the WNBA and women's basketball in general, one of the things that I think is really fascinating is sort of around the lines that you mentioned, that the WNBA came out really hot. Like the first few years, it was drawing big crowds and all these things. There was a little bit of a plateau, to your point, and now it's certainly growing again. But one of the things that I think is really interesting that I don't think most basketball fans really realize is that you were part of a group that essentially beta tested the development of the league. Right. And what I'm talking about is, I think it was it 95 where the USA women's basketball team went essentially on tour before the Olympics in 96. Can you just tell me a little bit more about how that decision came about and why you guys went and did that?
Well, it did flow from the relationship that the NBA had beginning in 92, really the years leading into 92, first Olympics with NBA players, and the relationship with USA basketball. Because when the NBA and USA basketball went into business together, the focus was very much on men's basketball. The first dream team in Barcelona, the second dream team that played in the first FIBA World Cup that NBA players were participating. That was in Toronto in 94, the Atlanta Olympics in 96 with the third dream team, et cetera. In 92 and 94, USA basketball was also fielding women's teams that were representing their country, but they were quietly losing. In 92, the women's USA Olympic team got the bronze medal in Barcelona. And in 94, they got the bronze medal in the Women's World Championship in Australia, while the men were sort of riding high with these NBA players. So USA basketball was getting a bit panicked about how they could, get their perch back at the top of the basketball world on the women's side. We were seeing a successful partnership with USA basketball on the men's side. And, this guy, David Stern, was thinking in his head, I'd like to start a women's league at some point, and maybe some of these factors can begin to coalesce here and come together in a way that could lay a foundation for what I hope could someday be a WNBA. And so that's where, I came in, because I was, at that time, the women's basketball brain trust at the league office. I was one of the liaisons with USA basketball on the men's side. And so the idea that I and others came up with was, look, we can't afford to lose the gold medal in Atlanta. We got to do something different in terms of how we train the team. We've seen the success of a dream team on the men's side. So how about creating a dream team on the women's side that would be together for more than the few weeks leading into the Atlanta games, that could travel around the country, get a lot of training under their belt. But yes, the ulterior motive for the NBA was maybe we can use this as a way to test the interest by fans, sponsors, networks, media in high-level women's basketball. So long story short, we were able to recruit the best women's players at that time, convince them to take 10 months to be part of this tour, came up with a schedule of domestic games as well as some games outside of the USA, so that by the time Atlanta rolled around, they'd been together for months. They were 52-0. They were attracting good crowds. We had the stars of that time, including Rebecca Lobo, who had just come off a national championship at UConn, Lisa Leslie, Cheryl Swoops, and others. And while they were doing their thing, and USA Basketball was fronting that, we were kind of quietly building a business plan around a women's pro league that would launch under the NBA brand in the summer, because we thought TV was more plentiful then, beginning in the summer of 1997, the year after the Olympics. And that's basically what came together, Joe. It's a longer story than that, but it was, again, picking up on the interest that we saw in the women's college basketball, riding the NBA's relationship with the Dream Team and USAB, and then basically taking advantage of the Olympic platform in Atlanta as a launch pad for the work that would follow.
Did NBA owners push back on that idea at all or no?
Not much. I mean, this is where, again, I credit David Stern. He was the guy calling the Jerry Busses and the Gordon Guns and the Larry Millers and the Bill Davidsons of the world to say, hey, I've got this idea. NBA business at that time was very good. David was very empowered because he had brought so much success to the league that the owners trusted him. And when he said, I really do think we can own basketball year round with this league, because it was, again, the plan was to play in the summer. As part of the vision was we can have 12 months a year of basketball at the highest level here. Play the NBA whenever it plays, and then put the WNBA in that, quote, off season. Use NBA or
more valuable to the cable companies.
Exactly. A lot of our teams at that time had regional sports networks. It was programming in the summer months. It was a way to use their emptier buildings. They still had a concert business, but they could use their buildings in the summer. And it was a way, frankly, to own basketball year round. So David was very convincing with the owners. And as best I know, I'm sure he had some resistance. Not everybody wanted a team right away. We only started with 8 teams. But after the first year, we had 10. Then we got to 12. Then we got to 16 in a hurry because of what you noted, that early success that we had. After we got to 16, things started to bottom out a little bit. And now the league's, I think, at 12, and they're looking to grow, which is great, and get back up to where we were with 16 because of the surge of interest on the renaissance, if you will, around this. But the NBA bought into the idea that this was good for business. And to their credit, mostly bought into the idea that it was good for business long term, even if the short term returns were not necessarily going to be there.
Yeah, because I think people look at it today and, people read reports around how much the NBA was funding and what they weren't paying for and things like that. And at the beginning, it seems like owners were in because they were seeing the crowds and seeing everything. That hit a little bit of a plateau. But at that point, the league was making so much money and the enterprise value of the teams had gone up so much where maybe it wasn't as impactful as it would have been a decade prior. And now you're at a point where I'm sure the owners were happy that they stuck it out and they're, the business is growing to a larger degree. But that's all par for the course, I guess. Val, last question I have for you is around the Hall of Fame. What was it like getting inducted? Like, who calls you? What's that process like?
Well, so the official call came from John DeLeva, who is the longtime president of the Hall. Has been in the job for many, many years. Has done a great job. I had actually served on their board for many years, not as a Hall of Famer, but as an executive. I was one of the NBA's appointees to the Hall of Fame Board of Trustees. So I served in that role for many years. I was very familiar with the organization, had been to many enshrinements, had watched, colleagues, heroes making their speeches. I never dreamed I'd be up there myself. So when the call came, it was a wow moment, for sure. And I, incredibly honored to be in the company of, again, so many legends around the game of basketball. I came through what was called the Contributor Committee. So the Hall, in addition to recognizing players and coaches, and officials from time to time, if there's a longstanding ref, they do have a category where they recognize long-serving executives. And so David Stern is in as a contributor. My boss, Russ Granick, is in as a contributor. A dear friend, Rick Welts, who was the longtime CMO of the NBA and ran the Golden State Warriors, is in as a contributor. So these are, friends and colleagues of mine. So to be in their company as well, was just sort of, unimaginable at that level. So, a big night for me, for sure. My induction was during COVID, so that was, it wasn't able to bring as many people in as I had hoped because of concerns about traveling, but nonetheless, a huge honor just the same.
Amazing. Well, you certainly deserve it for all the work across, a variety of different organizations at this point. And I look forward to seeing what the Big East does in basketball this season. But Val, thanks so much for joining me.
Great, Joe. Great being with you. Thanks again.